Can Christians trust non-Christians? It's a very interesting question. It's one that most or probably all Christians are going to come across at various points in their lives. Today, I'm going to be answering two history-specific questions that are really trying to deal with whether or not Christians can trust non-Christians as far as history goes. The two questions are, first, is it important for an historian to be a practicing confirmed Christian? And secondly, how does one apply a Christian worldview to the study of history? So I'm going to take, in this video, I'm going to take these two questions, I'm going to reframe them a little bit, and I'm going to offer you the best answer that I have for that. Let's begin by taking a look at question number one. Is it important for an historian to be a practicing confirmed Christian or confirmed practicing Christian? And so I would like to reframe that question, first of all, and ask this one instead. Is it possible for a non-Christian to be a historian? Is it possible for a non-Christian to be a historian? And I would start by saying that, well, there are lots of other fields and other jobs in which we don't even think of asking this question. So, for example, can a non-Christian be a good chef? Well, for sure. I mean, if you look at the skills that are required to be a chef, those skills don't necessarily require someone to be a Christian to be good at that particular job. Same thing could be true for a teacher, but is not true for a pastor. Can a non-Christian be a pastor? Well, no, because the skill set that is required to be a pastor really depends upon someone's essence being Christian. And so that would be one example where no, you need to be a Christian to be able to fulfill that job correctly. Now, I think that what we're really looking at here when we're trying to see if someone has to be a Christian to fulfill a certain kind of job or calling or vocation, what really comes down to is what exactly is the person producing, or what exactly is the subject matter that this person is dealing with to do this job. And so if we take a look at how a historian goes about doing his or her work, then we can probably identify whether or not someone needs to be a Christian to be able to do that work. So what exactly does a historian do? Well, first, a historian does a lot of research. And second, a historian takes this research and then reinterprets it or interprets it and then reports it in some way, shape, or form. That's according to our textbook. So does a historian have to be a Christian to be able to do research? Well, absolutely not. No, anyone, Christian or non-Christian, can do research. Does a historian need to be a Christian to be able to interpret the sources? Well, there are going to be differences between a Christian and a non-Christian, different presuppositions, but no, a person doesn't have to be a Christian to be able to do that well. And then lastly, do you have to be a Christian to be able to write or make documentaries or whatever? Well, certainly not. And so, no, I don't believe that a Christian a historian needs to be a Christian in order to be a good historian. Now, to answer this question in a bit of a deeper way yet, I'd like to go look at what the essence of truth is. So, what is truth? It's a question that Pilate asked at the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's a very, very deep question. What is truth? And I believe that truth is God. God is truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so truth in its most basic form is God. And that's a little bit hard for us to understand because we tend to think of truth as being propositional or like a body of knowledge that we can know. And this is a little bit different because God as a person or God as the Trinity is actually truth. Now, the truth that we tend to think of is the truth that God created. So God created everything that we know. God created the reality that we know. And in so doing, created a bunch of truths, maybe small t, truths. And so I believe that all of these truths are like subsets of the truth, which is God. So I believe that people are quite capable of knowing very well subsets of the truth. They know a lot of truths without necessarily knowing the source of the truth. And so I'd like to take you to a metaphor yet, just to wrap up this portion of the video. I'd like you to imagine a large red brick wall. Now, someone could be very good at knowing lots of things about that wall, or they can know something about a specific section of that wall. They may know a certain brick really, really well and never know anything about the master bricklayer who actually put the wall there. And so I believe this is a bit of a rough metaphor, but it can kind of work in this case. People can be really good at knowing the bricks without actually knowing the great brick master layer. Okay, I'd like to move on now to the second question yet, which is, how does one apply a Christian worldview to the study of history? Oh, that's a great question. Very good question. I believe every Christian historian at some point in time needs to answer this question. So how exactly does this work if you're a Christian? So as I was really pondering this question, I realized that it actually might be easier to answer this question if a Christian historian is compared to a secular historian. And so that's what I'm going to do. And I'm actually going to reframe the question a little bit and ask this. How does the work of a Christian historian differ from the work of a secular historian? So let me lay down some definitions first. What do I mean by a Christian historian? Well, what I mean by a Christian historian is someone who believes that God exists, that God is the originator of the entire universe. The universe is derived, universe and reality comes from God, and that God is really the essence of our reality. Second, a Christian historian is going to believe that God inspired the Bible, and in so doing, that means the Bible is actually reliable, it's believable, and it actually has an impact on people's lives. And third, that God is the source of objective truth. Now, I'm going to compare that to a secular historian. So what I mean by a secular historian is a historian who's either an atheist, agnostic, or just completely ambivalent about whether or not God exists. And so what a secular historian, as I'm defining one, would believe about the origins of the universe is that the universe the origin of the universe is a mystery. Maybe at best there may be some sort of mathematical reason or something that science will eventually discover, but we really don't know where the universe came from. They would also believe that instead of God being kind of the essence of our reality, they instead believe that nature and biology are really the essence of our reality. Secondly, a secular historian would definitely not believe that the Bible is inspired by God, since God wouldn't necessarily even exist, but they would instead believe that the Bible is just some wisdom literature amongst a lot of wisdom literature that's been written across the history of mankind. And then lastly, a secular historian may or may not believe in objective truth. A couple of years ago, I probably would have said, well, a secular historian definitely believes that objective truth is not out there to be found. But more recently, there have been atheists who believe, like new atheism, as led by people like Sam Harris of the Waking Up podcast, are stating that that objective truth can actually exist, but without there being the existence of a divine being of some kind, which has been really difficult for me to kind of get my head around. But there are definitely people out there who deny the existence of God, but still believe that objective truth does exist and try to nail it to something besides God. But so a secular historian may believe that objective truth exists and may not believe that. That would probably depend on how postmodern that they are. Okay, now let's take a look at some similarities and some differences between a Christian historian and a secular historian. So let's take a look at the similarities. Well, it's really just one similarity that I could come up with. And I should put a little caveat out there first and say that as I was really mulling over this, about what the difference is between a Christian historian and a secular historian, I realized that actually a lot of the work looks very similar. But then there are going to be a couple of key places where their work is going to differ, and most of it comes from from the differences in the presuppositions, like I kind of laid out before. These three things that Christians believe that secular historians would not. That's where most of the difference is going to come from. But how does that really have a bearing on the work? Well, first, let's take a look at how that Christian historians and secular historians would be similar. And I believe that they would pretty much be similar in how they go about doing their research. As I was looking at the 9 principles, the 9 principles as outlined by Liberty University, it struck me that principle number 4 and principle number 7, which both deal with how to do research, both of them lay out this idea that research needs to be done honestly and with some degree of morality. And I believe that both a Christian and a non-Christian historian would pretty much believe the same thing. They may differ a little bit about how to word that, but they would pretty much both agree to number 4 and number 7. Then the rest of that document pretty much is dealing with like presuppositions that Christians would have that a non-Christian would not. So they would be similar in how they go about conducting their research. Now, how are they going to be different? Well, a Christian historian and a non-Christian historian are going to be pretty different in how they go about interpreting the sources. And so I was really trying to get my head around this again, because I can see how that in a lot of ways, depending on the subject matter, a Christian and a secular historian would probably even interpret data pretty much the same. And I realized that it appears that as Christians or secular historians are trying to interpret the data as it applies to us today, that's really where the difference is going to be found between in their work. So here, I've got one example here for you. I was thinking about how that a Christian historian would interpret the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s versus how a secular historian would probably interpret that. So I'm just going to say this, that a Christian historian would probably start with the presupposition that the nuclear family is really the smallest unit of our society, because you can build a pretty strong case, I believe, from the Bible that is true. While a secular historian isn't going to believe that so much, they might have much more of the "it takes a village" approach to raising children, which allows there to be quite a bit more freedom in how women are able to raise their children. And so the impact that the women's liberation movement has had on our culture today is going to be interpreted pretty differently by a Christian historian versus a secular historian. One of them would look at it more negatively, one would look at it more positively. So that'd be one example I've got there for you. So interpretation would be the primary difference, and research would be the primary similarity between how a Christian and a secular historian would approach their work. Okay, I've got one more example yet for you to sort of further explain how this would work. How they would be similar and how they'd be different. The first the example I've got here for you is imagine that a Christian historian and a secular historian would both be trying to produce a documentary that explains the motivations of the Columbine shooters. And they're both producing this for, let's say, primetime TV, and so they've got a very similar audience and so on. And so all things being equal, how would they approach their work differently? Well, like I said before, they probably would both approach their work pretty much the same when they're actually conducting interviews and stuff. However, I did come across one idea here that I think I need to kind of lay out, and that is that there actually may be a slight difference in how they go about doing their research, like gathering information on this. And that is that a Christian historian or a historian really asks questions and then tries to answer those questions. And so a Christian historian, when trying to, well, actually, I should say this first. A secular historian, when trying to answer this question of what exactly inspired the Columbine shooters, is probably going to look mostly at like sociological and psychological reasons for why the Columbine shooters did what they did. And a Christian historian will probably look at those things, but will have this sort of deep down preconceived idea that really at the heart of it all there was something sinful going on, and so they will probably ask questions that head more toward the spiritual side as well. And so here a Christian historian and a secular historian are going to approach the research a little bit differently, and then when it's time to actually interpret the data, they are definitely going to interpret things a little bit differently, because the Christian is obviously going to sort of lean toward a more spiritual understanding of what the problem was that inspired these boys to do what they did, while a secular historian would even think of asking those questions and would not interpret their findings at all with a spiritual bent to them. Okay, thanks so much for listening. The questions again were do you have to be a practicing Christian to be a historian? And I would say no. And the second question was, if you are a Christian, you're a historian, how does your Christian worldview impact your work? I'd say, well, basically, you've got some preconceived ideas that you're going to be working from, and that is going to lead you down certain roads that a secular historian would not go down. Thanks.